They told us Jenny and Sumit were the underdog fairy tale, the impossible love story that defied every odd and crossed the finish line with a couple who gave everything for each other and proved that love knows no age, no border, limit. But what if I told you that was never the truth? What if instead the truth has been hiding under edits and off-camera drama? What if instead, when Jenny said I do, it was also the moment she walked away with nothing, and not just emotionally, but psychologically, spiritually, and even financially, because what you never saw, what TLC never got to show, was the 6 words whispered following their final fight, and 6 words which would have ruined the whole franchise if shown. And 6 words which ended everything, and once you know them, you will never again look at Jenny the same way again, and that is because the woman who left India was far from the same woman who arrived there and erased and reduced to nothing. And by the time she boarded that plane, she wasn't crying for it to be over. She was crying for it all to be a lie. All along, Jenny met Sumit during the catfish episode, when he was posing as a young model from London, and she chose to believe it. Because she wanted to believe it, she wanted to believe that after a lifetime of being overlooked, forgotten, and aging out of relevance, that someone finally saw her, that someone chose her. And even after the lie was revealed, when Sumit admitted that he was not what she thought he was, she stayed. And that right there was the beginning of her erasure, because every choice she made after that was based on denial, not love, not reality, but denial. She quits her job, she leaves her grandkids, she sells her possessions and flies across the world for a man who couldn't even tell his parents she existed. A man that lied about his marriage and was leading her on for years, telling her that he was getting a divorce when he was not, and we all watched it as if it were a quirky culture clash story, when in fact it was a masterclass in manipulation. And to make it even more egregious, the entire time Jenny thought she was fighting for the real thing. She did not know that the reality show was exploiting her in much the same way that Sumit did, with every tear she shed in every argument they edited, to music in every episode in which she begged Sumit to support her, in every episode in which she asked Sumit to stand up for her, only to be broken down in front of millions. It wasn't enough that it was reality television, it was torture. They needed her to shatter, they needed her to cry, they needed her to come back. Because they were exploiting love, they were exploiting her pain. And things that were cut from the final broadcast, things that were left on the cutting room floor, were Jenny's breakdowns between shoots, in which she yelled at pillows, in which she told the camera crew she felt like she was losing her mind. None of the producers who left the show shared what message came from one of the producers concerning when they realized that Jenny had reached her breaking point. It was during with Sumit's mother, where she said she would never be accepted. And Jenny was supposed to keep it together, nod, maybe shed a tear or two, but instead, she walked out onto set and locked herself in a bathroom for over an hour, sobbing uncontrollably, screaming, "I gave up my whole life for this. I gave up everything. And no one cares." And when they finally managed to coax her out, her eyes were puffed up, her throat was raw from screaming, and her very first words were, "I should have never come here." This marked the beginning of the end, but then I understood how it's so simple to say, why didn't she just get out? Why didn't she just walk away? Because what emotional abuse does? It creates the illusion that this is your only choice. It makes you feel isolated, it grinds you down, it convinces you that if you just hold on a little while longer, things will get better, but they don't get better. They get worse. After the wedding, Sumit began to stop pretending. Insiders reported that Sumit became distant and cold. He'd go hours without speaking to her off camera. Sumit began to travel alone, giving her excuses. He'd be gone for hours at a time. Then when Jenny asked him what his whereabouts were, he'd simply say, "Don't worry about it." And when she cried, he'd say, "Stop being so dramatic." But then came the point that would change everything. That point was when Jenny realized that it was not about love, that it was about a level of betrayal that happened in her home. When she heard Sumit's father speaking on the phone, that voice laughing in Hindi, when all she managed to hear was a phrase that roughly translates to "she believed it." That was when Jenny understood that she was not only being rejected, but that she was being mocked. When she asked Sumit what was going on, he waved it off that he was being ridiculous, that his father was a crank, but that night Jenny recorded a voice memo that was sent to her daughter that read, "I think this whole thing is a scam. I don't think I was ever meant to be here," if you've ever felt that punch to the gut. That moment of truth when reality finally dawns on you to the point you can't breathe, then you understand what Jenny felt at that moment. Not only was she losing Sumit, she was losing herself. Her identity, her sense of purpose. Her belief that this story was ever hers to tell to begin with, because what happened next showed just how far-reaching the deceit went. A family friend of Sumit's drew Jenny aside during a visit and told her something that blew apart the whole situation. He told her, "Sumit's been approached for a television deal with producers a year ago. He was offered a contract renewal if you stick with her and continue this story with you. We'll give you a raise," and that's when reality cracked into place. Because if that's true, then Jenny's whole world was a lie. Every "I love you" was a lie, every tear shed was a lie, every kiss was a lie, every fight that ended with a hug was a lie. Jenny was the only one who didn't have a script to follow. I just want to stop here because this is where it gets me every time. To think of being in a foreign place by yourself with no friends and no family in sight. And the only person you gave everything to might be using you for a paycheck, and the people recording it all have no interest in getting in the way or keeping you safe. But just continue to record, because the worse it gets, the better it gets in terms of ratings. And Jenny didn't learn the truth about what was happening to her through interaction. She learned it through observation in the little things. Sumit's flinch as she reached out to touch him in a place they weren't being recorded in. His reluctance to look her in the eye if they weren't rolling. The change in his voice as soon as they yell, "Cut, now comes the 6 words." That the TLC network was not going to show when Jenny finally realized she was finished. During a savage fight during which she accused Sumit of being dishonest about his plans all along, of never meaning for them to put a real life together. Sumit eventually says something so chilling, so calculating, that it stops Jenny cold when he says, "I never thought you'd last this long." Jenny looked at him and then at the crew before saying, "I'll never go back to him," and that was it. 6 words that were destined not to be heard. Because they were not dramatic enough for television, they were not screamed or thrown like a glass of wine. They were simply whispered and broken. Those 6 words. It was more than just an exit strategy from India. It was an awakening. Jenny was not leaving Sumit. Jenny was leaving the illusion that any of this was ever love. As Jenny walked out of the house, she did not look back, not once, not even when Sumit tried to follow her, not even when the cameras tried to stop her, as if, in this moment, Jenny was not the cast member but Jenny, the woman who had finally understood that she was worth more than this. And if you're like me in this narrative that is about to sink deep within your bones, I encourage you to embrace this feeling, because trust me when I say that this is only the start of the unraveling that is about to occur as we now enter the leaked texts from Sumit's mom, the sabotage within his family. The point Jenny understood that rejection was always the plan on the first day. And the evidence that confirms this, the night after Jenny whispered these 6 words, everything around her began to change. And this had nothing to do with Sumit begging her to remain or with the production team being concerned, but with a new level of betrayal emerging. One that had been lurking in the open all along, and this time, it had nothing to do with Sumit, but with his family and what they had been doing from behind the scenes, from the moment this whole reality show had begun. And this is what Jenny did not know. And this is something that never made it onto the show. There were private chat rooms between Sumit's parents and some of his relatives, and even one of the cultural consultants from the reality show, in which Jenny had been consistently insulted and ridiculed and teased in ways that were both degrading and humiliating, and were never anything but calculating, as if they were working toward her meltdown. And when this leaked, when a young translator made copies of some texts and passed these along to one of the producers who had left the show earlier, this is when things escalated. as in these texts there were timestamps a number of years back, while in one of these, Sumit's mother stated point blank, "I don't care what he promised her, he knows what this is." And this wasn't shocking, but devastating because she confirmed Jenny's worst fear, that she never felt welcome, accepted, or taken seriously. That Sumit's promises of defending himself against his family were simply an act. While in one of the texts Sumit's father told her she wasn't there forever, that she'd go back home when she got tired of waiting, and all the while, this is how things begin to come undone in an entirely new way that Jenny discovered these messages, not through production, not through honesty, but through an outsider who couldn't take it anymore. An outsider who had been riding with the crew for 3 years and had witnessed enough. Enough breakdowns, enough sleepless nights, enough late-night tears with Jenny wailing away in the backseat, with Sumit walking ahead, pretending not to listen, until the driver got her the messages and showed her where she could find them, and when she did, she didn't cry, she froze. Think about living among people who smile at you while stabbing you in the back with millions of people watching your moves on television. Imagine being the only one in a room that doesn't get the joke that's on you. Imagine finding out that all the kind words, all the tolerance gestures were moves in a game that wore you down and broke your spirit. It wasn't just a family disagreement, it was psychological warfare, and Jenny had been walking through it barefoot all these years. This time around, as she was packing her bags again, it was not dramatic. She did not yell or beg. Instead, she started quietly folding her clothes as soon as the cameras went off. And then when Sumit asked her to tell him where she was heading, all she said was, "I am not staying in this house." For the first time in their relationship till now, Sumit did not follow her. Instead, he stood there. And it was apparent that he knew it was all over and that there was nothing left to be scripted now. And the reason this was not portrayed on television is that it's not interesting and was not full of enough drama. Instead, it was only a lady throwing in the towel. However, here's where things took a turn, because even after that, even after leaving the house, Jenny didn't fly back to America immediately, because she decided to remain at a hotel in Delhi for another 6 days, during which time a very weird pattern started happening. The producers started coming to her at odd hours, not for interviews or filming, but just so that they could persuade her to return, because they would offer her more money, more airtime, even a spin-off series. But when they were asked what the reason was for all of these sudden changes, because they wanted her back, because they needed closure, because they wanted resolution, because they didn't want the story incomplete, they got nowhere, because what they actually wanted was another breakdown, because they wanted an actual final. But what none of us expected was that Jenny has been taping all of these conversations for her own purposes, not the least of which is that one of the recordings is of the producer representing us when he says that we need something emotional with you. Otherwise, we won't have an ending, in which Jenny asks them what that looks like. To which they say something like, "You walking away would be perfect." In which she realizes that they never wanted her to be happy, they only wanted her to be devastated. They only wanted her to be defeated. And I'm gonna stop right here, because if you're listening to this, if you think this feels like more than drama, if it feels like a form of exploitation, then you're absolutely right, because it's not just one relationship that's ending here. It's a system that preys on vulnerability to create content from real people's pain, and then polishes the truth so neatly that you almost forget that you're watching a human being's mental health deteriorate before your eyes. But what did Jenny do with all these recordings? Well, she sent them all to her daughter for safekeeping, and just in case anything ever happened. She wanted someone outside of the production company to know what the real story was. And the hardest part of all is that one of these recordings ends with Jenny saying, "I don't know who I am anymore." And she cracks with tears, not for the camera and not for Sumit, but for herself. And it is not an acting job, it is a woman lost. However, the last jab in this chapter came when a source from the TLC came out with a contract clause that showed not only was Jenny being underpaid for her contracts compared with the other girls, She worked with each season, but she was under a non-disclosure clause which prevented her from expressing what was really going on during shooting. And you know what they further added into the contract after she left last season: a fine for disparaging production, which means they knew they went too far with Jenny and they were legally protecting themselves in case she ever spoke out. And it is where we see the final confrontation between Jenny and Sumit. But not the loud one full of shouting and crying, but the quiet one, where she reveals that she read messages. She understood what his family said to him, and his answer was not something. But nothing Jenny finally understood, in that nothing that she was never a part of a plan. But she was a plan now. I just have to say that if you're still listening, and you feel like every time you think it can't possibly get worse, it somehow does. That's what we experienced in living through it for Jenny, for myself, and all of us who are interested in what's going on behind the scenes. The next phase of this saga is about to kick in, because after Jenny left Delhi, she did not go home, instead making her final move that no one expected, one that could blow this entire situation wide open. Brace yourself for what's coming next, because we are hardly finished, and what Jenny does next will turn the whole situation upside down again, just when you thought that was the end of it all. Jenny changes everything again. Jenny didn't go to the airport after she checked out of the hotel. She didn't text her daughter to come home. She didn't even call a cab right away. She went down a side street and sat on a bench and stayed there for almost 2 hours, and it's only because a production person trailed her in what appeared to be an effort to capture what they could of her breakdown that we have any resolution to this story, because they finally approached her and asked her if she was okay, and she didn't even have the decency to look up and just said, "I'm deciding whether to disappear or expose everything." And that right there was the turning point, because what Jenny did after that wasn't for the cameras. It wasn't for Sumit or for the audience or for her daughter. It was for herself. And so she took the SIM card out of her phone, broke it put it in a trash bin, and went to an internet cafe where she used one of their computers to send an encrypted email to a former cast member who also had been silenced by the NDA letters of TLC's contracts. And in this encrypted email, Jenny wrote, "I know what they did to you. I know exactly how they've twisted your story. And I think it's time we start talking." And then what ensued was the start of something entirely unexpected: a domino effect of leaks, stories, screenshots, photos, audio files, and conversations with producers, none of which were ever intended to escape the hard drives they were stored on, but all of which began leaking out onto private Discord servers, anonymous Reddit accounts, and encrypted messaging apps, not only because Jenny was an anomaly, but because she was only the first of many who decided enough was enough. Now, remember back when I mentioned earlier that TLC included a provision in Jenny's contract at the end of her final season stating that she could face legal consequences if she ever spoke out. When they didn't expect her to speak out is that she didn't have to speak out. She only had to ignite the sparks in the folks who had witnessed the whole thing firsthand, who were simply waiting for someone to go first, after which the whole thing began to burn. One of the most damaging leaks was from a former field producer who had been working on the narrative of Jenny and Sumit for 3 years, and he shared a bombshell in a voice remark that surfaced through anonymous means. He alleged, "We were told to make Jenny more desperate because it tested well with audiences. Each time she threatened to leave, they wanted us to convince her not to leave, but from behind the camera, and if she cried, they wanted us to keep rolling until she broke, and if she didn't break, they wanted us to reshoot until she did, and it doesn't end there." As one of the members of the cast anonymously revealed that one of the most emotional arguments, Jenny and Sumit, which ended with Jenny crying outside their apartment, was actually filmed 3 times, because the first time Jenny didn't cry enough, the second time her mic wasn't working, and the third time was when they somehow got her raw enough to air. This is where I must pause once more and just say that if you are still thinking this was a toxic relationship, that means you are missing the larger picture in that this was a machine designed to draw on emotion, package it, sell it back to us and that Jenny was one of the largest components of that source material. In that she never stopped feeling and that she never learned how to feel in that. Instead, she heard in that they took every bit of that. No, let's talk about the fight that never aired, the one that came after Jenny had already revealed everything she had seen, heard, and read about the internal notes from the production company herself, where she'd been deemed emotionally volatile and needed to be placed on. Who she realized she'd been deceived from the very start, and according to sources on that fateful confrontation between the two, Sumit did not deny anything, but instead said, "I thought you wanted to be on TV." And that one statement felt like a knife because all the good times, all the friendly smiles, all the cultural concessions were all reduced to something that could be bargained. Not Sharadik gets even worse because this final kind of leakage came from an audio recording of a pre-interview with the producer himself, who told Jenny to tap into her sad feelings in order to be more vulnerable, in order to give the listeners what they want. And at this point, you could hear Jenny let out a real sigh and say she's sick to death of being sad, and the producer says, softly, "Then you have to learn to pretend," and it is at this point that Jenny did finally break in a way that wasn't on camera in the way they wanted. Because she didn't know how to pretend, not with love, not with pain, not with betrayal also. When Jenny finally left India for the final time, it wasn't with a storyline to return home. It was with silence. No press, no statements, no social media, no reunion appearance. Jenny vanished. And although speculation was rampant that she was giving herself time to heal, the reality is that she was working on a case, gathering evidence, gathering witnesses, trying to piece together a timeline to figure out how she'd swung from being a girl, searching for a piece of her own happiness, to a piece of fuel for another storyline. She didn't get to create just when you think you've heard it all. There's an even more frightening experience that Jenny had after returning to the U.S. after filming. She received a legal letter that stated TLC was willing to sue her if she made public what she knew, including what another cast member might tell her of their experiences. However, instead of backing down, Jenny went ahead and sought advice from a media lawyer. And what she discovered next was the start of a massive opportunity. Apparently, there was a loophole in her contract that she could benefit from. Anything that was not the possession of the TLC could not be used or could not fall within their jurisdiction. This meaning that if other people came out and spoke out about what they knew, there was nothing that the TLC could do. Jenny could keep quiet as the truth shouted out louder than ever before. And so the question now that Jen's disappeared from the public eye, but the leaks continue, is what happens now. Because if she is able to prove that the emotional distress was engineered, if she is able to prove that she can get enough evidence of the crew members and the cast members and the people on the inside, there's a chance that the whole empire could begin to crumble. Because let me tell you, if you're still with me and your heart is racing, just remember we're not even through yet. Because in the next part, we're going to analyze what Jenny's daughter uncovered. After she came back, messages she received, private journal entries she unearthed, and when she confronted TLC's law team about something so damning they shut down. When Jenny arrived in California, she didn't go home, but stayed with her daughter Christina. And for the first few days, Jenny didn't speak at all. She wasn't sleeping, she wasn't eating. All she was doing was sitting by the window looking out at the street, as if waiting for someone to return who never would. But then on the third night, something shifted. Christina caught Jenny in the living room with a fat manila envelope jammed with printed out emails, scrawled notes, and screenshots. And when Christina asked her what it was for, Jenny simply shook her head and said this is everything they never showed her, which is what Christina knew wasn't over. Christina began going through the files, and the more she read, the angrier she was. Text conversations between producers discussing Jenny as being too flat unless she's crying, the breakdown of shooting schedules, showing the deliberate isolation of Jenny before important emotional scenes, pages from call sheets, with the message of only reminding her she has nowhere else to go, and most egregious of all, the printed email page of one of the coordinators in the field, saying Sumit is ready to push Jenny as well if that will assist in their stories of development. And that was the point that opened something up in Christina, because she knew she'd been supporting her crazy mom through every single twist. When she finally realized the monster behind the curtain, and it's at this point where things started going downhill for Christina, because she didn't just keep this information to herself. She set up a meeting with an attorney and brought all this stuff, and after they reviewed it, they said, well, your mother has a claim for emotional distress. But going public is going head to head with one of the most powerful networks in reality TV. And Christina's reaction is what? Then let's go. Meanwhile, word began to leak among some former cast members because Jenny had been reaching out to them, not asking them to speak out, but asking if they had had an experience like hers. And the tales began to spill. One former cast member talked about how they were fed lines in emotional scenes. One member talked about being invited to drink before a fight. One woman related they were told, if you want to stay on this show, you have to keep the drama going even if it means at odds with this one theme. Silence and fear of losing what little they had left. Jenny didn't ask for revenge. Jenny asked for truth, but the truth is heavy. It's hard to carry, especially when you've been told for so long that your pain is content, your heartbreak is plotline, your tears are assets. And so, when Christina found the journal Jenny had kept during the shooting of the reality show, filled with her unedited, unfiltered thoughts, fears, inhibitions, and moments of utter breakdown, Christina began crying, not for the entries, but for realizing her mother had been screaming the whole time. But no one was listening. In one entry, Jenny wrote, I feel like I'm disappearing a little more every day. They keep telling me to trust them, but every time I do, I lose a piece of myself. In another entry, I don't know if Sumit ever loved me or if he just loved what I gave up to be here. Perhaps the most heartbreaking one, I miss who I was before I met him. When it couldn't get any worse, Christina found not only the letter that Jenny penned, but also realized that she tried explaining everything she wanted to apologize for. I'm sorry you believed what I believed. I'm sorry you thought it was real. I thought it was too. And at the end of this letter were the same 6 words. She told right before they got into the van, I will never come back to him. And she underlined the word never 3 times. Now here's the twist that completely took everyone by surprise. Because in the midst of all of this, the TLC network had fallen silent with no statements, number comment, no threats, but that silence spoke volumes because later on, sources revealed that they were having internal meetings about damage control in order to try to determine which of Jenny's evidence would actually be admissible in court, in a bid to try to shut her down when in reality, Christina had begun to distribute the evidence anonymously through third-party accounts to news editors, YouTubers, and lawyers who were waiting for someone with the guts to take on the system. But then a massive thing happened. Christina got an anonymous package in the mail. No return address, no note, just a USB drive, and when Christina connected it to her computer, it contained raw video footage that had not been edited, any clips that had never aired from their season, and then there was one clip that showed a producer literally telling Sumit to bring up the idea of marriage just to get a reaction from Jenny. And that changes everything because it shows orchestration rather than documentation, which has always been denied by the TLC. Jenny watched that video and cried for the first time since coming home, because she wasn't crying because she was sad, but because she was mad. She was finally furious, and finally she felt something besides shame. And finally she said, I didn't do anything wrong. That's when it all began. Not a comeback or a media stint, but the reclaiming of her voice. However, let me tell you what cemented this particular story into legend was when Christina stood up to a rep from TLC during a mediation teleconference and told them if they came at them with a clean-out attempt, they would bury them with the truth. And according to someone who was listening in, the line went dead for several seconds before the voice at the end of the line simply stated, we'll have to call you back. No one has heard from that rep since. And not that you thought it was finally all over, that Jenny had nothing left to share. There was one final surprise because what was tucked away inside that journal was something Christina hadn't been able to examine yet days after the fact. A small piece of paper taped to the inside of the back cover that reads "Only open" when it's really over, and inside was a name, a location, and a date. Which unsurprisingly leads not to the end of a relationship, but to the start of something else. Summers explains in Never Never what Jenny found could blow not only her story, but the whole premise of the series. And if what that final note means is true, then clearly we've hardly scratched the surface of what the extent of that story is. What was written on that piece of folded paper in the back of Jenny's journal was more than a name. It was a revelation that is a person who had never once appeared on screen, but was somehow complicit in it all from the beginning, a person who was not a member of the cast, or even a member of the initial crew, but was somehow deeply invested in Jenny and Sumit's story arc, and her name was Annika S. And her name was preceded by a date that was back when they appeared in the first season. And that was in a city in North India, not where Jenny and Sumit lived, but where initial rounds of castings took place, and that was exactly when Sumit was cast for the show, and that's when it all changed. This is because, as reported by insiders who left the production team, Annika was among the initial field researchers hired to evaluate and shortlist possible couples for the reality show. And Sumit's case was not unique to Annika because, as seen from Jenny's file, it was indicated that Jenny was willing to move, willing to overlook the age factor, and very emotional. And from the insider who viewed Jenny's file, Sumit was picked not because of who he is as a person, but because Jenny would be very easy to produce. And it's at this point that things start spiraling out, because there is now a certain belief that not only did they discover Jenny and Sumit, they produced them fashioned from day one specifically for the purpose of ensuring multiple seasons and high return value. And Annika's name keeps popping up in Amel's early cast correspondence personal conversations where she allegedly said she would bet her job that Jenny and Sumit would hold this show down for at least 3 years. And when it came time for them to marry, it wouldn't matter whether they wanted it or not, because they would be too invested to pull out. Such level of orchestration is not only messy, but verging on premeditated emotional sabotage. Because if Jenny's vulnerability was captured and used to inform the casting decision, if Jenny's readiness to be wounded was part of the package, then what is being seen here is not merely exploitation, but targeting. And Christina submitted this name to her own research and found out that Annika had left the company after season 6 with no announcement, no explanation, no goodbye on socials, but simply vanished into thin air. When they tried to reach out to her, her phone was disconnected and her socials erased. But a former editor who worked with her had a truly frightening comment he made directly to Christina, that Annika always knew too much. And then she told me, if Jenny ever finds out how deep this goes, we're all screwed. And that's when Jenny realized she never stood a chance. And now, let's move on to the money stuff. As for years, her fan base was wondering how Jenny was able to afford things in India, how she was able to maintain herself, how she was able to not be working. But now the answers are out, as part of her deal was live stipends, network supported. But this is the kicker, Jenny's stipend was lower than others in her tier. The reason why, according to internal network documents, was due to her lack of monetizable arc. Her lack of monetizable arc due to her age, her lack of glamorization, her desperation instead of her aspiration. But she was the very one who helped build the brand with her struggles, but still, her portion was lower due to network's belief that her inclusion was not marketable in our hand. I just have to pause for a second for that statement to sink in, because that level of callousness, that level of calculating the cost of somebody's broken heart in clicks and conversions to pay them less because they're not shiny enough, is the kind of behavior that should be illegal, but is instead business as usual. So Jenny did one thing that they never expected. She started documenting everything with dates, times, names, emails, screenshots, recordings. and she started putting together what's being called the Jenny Files. A huge folder full of enough raw evidence to support each and every claim she's made. And Christina is currently working on vetting all of this information with her small team, and if they put this out and gave it to the right journalist and or lawyer, they could blow this whole industry wide open because Jenny's not alone, and then there's the fight. That never aired. The last phone conversation Jenny had with Sumit weeks after she left India. According to the source who listened to the tape recording of the conversation, Jenny didn't scream. Jenny didn't cry. She only asked one question: why didn't you stop them? Sumit didn't answer for a quite lengthy period of time when he finally responded. I didn't think you'd stay, and this particular remark has haunted every aspect of this entire investigation because it proves the most dreaded fear of any person. Who has ever felt as if they have been loved? I didn't think you'd stay is no kind of apology, it's a confession. And just when you think that we've got the emotional peak, here comes the next twist. Because in one of the video files that have been sent to us anonymously, there's a clip of a situation which is when Sumit is with one of the producers in a filming break where the audio is low, but according to the transcript sent to us, one of them asked, "How's she holding up?" Sumit said he still believes that this is a reality show, after which both of them have a hearty laugh. And the clip closes, "That's not drama, that's cruelty, and the fact that it was captured means they knew what they were doing, they knew what they had, and they kept going." However, the tide has turned for Jenny because she now has something much stronger than a narrative. She has the truth, and the more people who see it, the harder it will become to shut Jenny down. And there are already rumblings of a documentary that would be an independent film that would not only document Jenny's journey, but also reveal what goes down behind reality TV contracts and manipulation, friendship that has turned into a weapon, and producers who act as friends. And then comes the part that no one is prepared for, because it is the individual who's been in contact with Christina in order to relay this telling of their own personal story that actually used to work in post-production at the TLC network. An individual who edited those final versions, who incorporated those music builds, who ensured the timing of those tears landed right on top of commercial breaks, and they are ready to talk, they are ready to share the evidence that's remained unaired. And much more importantly, the reasons why, and if they do, then this isn't about Jenny anymore, but every member on that cast that got devoured and edited down to be served to us on TLC. What happens next is up to what Jenny wants, because she is the one holding the story at this point, not the network, not the editors, not the man who told me I didn't think you'd stay, because while she is still silent at the moment, each day more files are coming out, and the individuals who once dictated the tagline are now panicking because they understand that once it goes public, it will be more than a scandal. But if you've made it this far, if you've lived every moment when Jenny swallowed her voice to smile anyway, then you are not just watching. You are seeing a woman reclaim her voice, one truth at a time. The next step came quietly, with neither announcement nor fanfare nor mysterious social media tease. It happened on a Thursday in a private legal office in Los Angeles, where Jenny sat opposite three attorneys, clutching a sealed envelope. Inside the envelope were printed copies of the contracts, the messages, the call transcripts, the leaked files, and at the very bottom, a notarized letter from Jenny that stated downright angrily she was prepared to sow testimony under oath about all that had transpired, from first DM to last day on set. And what astonished the legal team was not the amount of the documentation, but the fact that all of what she related could be substantiated, verified, and confirmed through carefully choreographed timelines that matched exactly with production records, episode showtimes, and post-production schedules. But while all of this is going on, a different type of silence is beginning to make its presence known, a silence that is more difficult to overlook. TLC's social media accounts suddenly ceased all references to Jenny entirely. Press recaps from previous seasons that she had been a part of didn't even include her name, despite continuing threads and storylines in some of these seasons that centered around her, and in some internal Slack threads, Production assistants picked up on a change in some new directives in regard to being careful not to make any sort of statement in regard to previous members with unresolved contract issues, because that is, when they realized that something had shifted behind the scenes because they were scared of Jenny. And here's what no one was expecting to Jenny: she was no longer alone. In the course of just 3 weeks, a wave of former cast members began coming forward to Christina, some of whom had never spoken out before, some of whom had attempted to speak up before being legally silenced, while others had been told not to trust their own narrative. Their pain wouldn't be believed unless it was in line with the narrative. Until Jenny was ready to stand up for herself, all of the above women felt as if they were yelling into the window. Of the women sent a voice note saying, "I've been waiting years to go first." Then there was, "I didn't even realize it was messing with me this way until I saw them doing it to her." Then there was the man who was labeled a villain in his season, who said that they were asking them to make statements that I never meant to make it edit well, and then chopped off the apology parts that I was making to them of myself. That I've been living in this way, and slowly something began to emerge, not a lawsuit, not a media stunt, not a spectacle, but something more humble and more menacing, a group, a conglomeration of people who had seen behind the curtain and weren't frightened anymore. Jenny wasn't trying to represent the movement. Jenny was trying to represent the start of something, and the more Jenny stayed down to earth, the more influence she seemed to gain, not because she had anything to sell, but because she wasn't selling anything at all. Jenny was simply speaking truth. But what will happen next will be a result of what these individuals choose to do with what they know. Because this story isn't going to end in a reunion or a wedding or a comeback episode. It's going to end in a mirror held up in front of the industry that profits from suffering because of the woman who finally stopped being edited into silence. Because beneath all of this, the best part of the story of Jenny will be that she escaped. She broke the cycle. She decided for herself and then never looked back. But then, right before she did, Christina discovered one last thing nestled between the pages of a folder. It was a printed screenshot message from long ago. It said, "You inspire me because you never gave up," and underneath it, Jenny had written in pen, "Maybe giving up was the bravest thing I ever did." Let that sink in for a second. Not all stories are about rescue, some are about reclaiming. Not all female heroes are rescued. Sometimes the only way she can restore herself is by burning the story down herself, and that's exactly what Jenny did, not for fame, not for revenge, but for the girl who believed in love so much she didn't know how to shield herself against the people who were using its ideals to destroy her. She's no longer quiet, and they're not ready for what is to come.